Hello everyone, this is Bobbin Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. For today's topic, I'll be touching on a very sociological question that can come up both when you're building a setting and when you're building a story. What exactly is civilization, and what isn't? Moreover, what does being in a civilization entitle you to that you don't get or don't deserve if you aren't civilized? The answer to these questions largely depends on what culture is answering them, and what era they're answering them in. But before I start wading into the weeds, let me start with a simple rule of thumb. The people who are civilized are always us, and the people who are uncivilized are always them. Not all of them, but certainly never us, even among those of us who think that being uncivilized would be better. Agriculture and cities. To get purely technical about the nature of civilization, I should first point out that city, citizen, and civilization all derive from the same root word. So, etymologically speaking, a society that builds cities is civilized, while those that don't build cities are uncivilized. There is a certain importance to that distinction, and it's based around agriculture. Cultures that understand the basics of agriculture and preservation can grow enough food every year to feed the population without having to move to a new location. And that means they can set up permanent structures without having to worry about wasting their hard work. Over time, an agrarian society will build up its population density and then build cities to act as political and distribution centers. So, while this purely technical definition only says that civilizations build cities, this does allow us to infer a few extra facts. First, a civilization must have a significant understanding of agriculture, including how to grow crop plants, how to raise domesticated animals, and how to preserve food for winters and droughts. Second, a civilization must exist in a fertile enough area to create a surplus of food using agriculture. Third, a civilization must have a sufficient population density to make building a city seem like a good idea. And as we have seen throughout the world, from Memphis to Athens to Babylon to Shanghai to Cahokia to Tenochtitlan, when these conditions are met, people will build cities. Nomads and Cities. Before people lived in fully sedentary societies, they lived as fully nomadic groups who would roam through a large tribal territory, or they would live as semi-sedentary societies who understood the basics of agriculture, but who would still pack up and move once they couldn't get enough food from the local environment. For thousands of years, all three types of society, nomadic, semi-sedentary, and sedentary, lived in overlapping territories, and often fought and raided each other over land rights and resources. So which of these groups would you call civilized, in a broader sense of the word? Well, we know from historical writings that city dwellers generally felt contempt towards the other two groups. But we know less about how the other groups felt because sedentary societies were the ones doing almost all of the writing. Nomads had their own stories and opinions, of course, but they were mostly oral traditions that were never written down and have become lost and forgotten. Still, the general consensus seems to be that nomads were considered wild, untrustworthy, and violent, while city dwellers were considered fat, lazy, and corrupt. Semi-sedentary societies, being in the middle, would both receive and accuse other societies of both sets of insults. Still, both nomads and city dwellers, at least on the individual level, have also admired each other's societies. To city dwellers, nomads are free, independent, and straightforward, whereas nomads would consider city dwellers to be safe, wealthy, and organized. There's also been plenty of movement between the two groups. When climate change causes a region to become inhospitable, city dwellers abandon their cities and return to a nomadic lifestyle. And when nomads experience a population boom, they either settle down themselves or they invade neighboring regions, take over existing cities, and ultimately integrate into the population. Raiders and cities. Something I want to make clear here is that raiders and nomads are not synonymous. Sedentary societies raid each other all the time. They just get more organized about it and call it war instead. Sometimes nomads will also organize together to invade a large territory, but on the whole, raiding is more common among nomads and wars are more common among cities. But as far as nomads go, raiding tends to be a one-way street. Nomads will raid cities, but cities won't raid nomads. This is because cities have concentrated resources, whereas nomads, for the most part, don't. But something nomads do have is land access, and something city dwellers have is a sense of vengeance, and so a sedentary society will attack a nomadic society, either to take their land or to punish them for an earlier raid. What all of this means is that organized violence is not an indicator of civilization, neither in the city-building sense nor in the superiority sense. However, the way violence is organized and the reason it gets organized does vary depending on the shape of a society, and so each one will tend to say that their version of organized violence is honorable and sensible, and any other version of organized violence is madness and death. Raiding is the only sensible option because you gain personal riches and glory, or war is the only sensible option because you must justify your actions before God and you fight for the greater glory of your king or nation. Colonies and Natives. When nomads invade a settled region, they take over existing cities and set themselves up as a new ruling class within the existing power structures. When sedentary societies invade a nomadic region, they build new cities and either push the nomads out of the area or force them to adopt their culture and way of life. If you're from the United States, you're probably familiar with a certain narrative called Manifest Destiny. It's the idea that the wilderness of North America was given to Europeans by God, and it's our God-given duty to settle and tame the land. What this narrative ignores is the fact that the land was already occupied and largely tamed by the Native Americans. The natives of New England had developed a 3-crop farming system of corn, beans, and squash. The natives of the Great Plains would regularly set fires to clear away trees and forests, since that increased the range and size of the bison herds they hunted. The Europeans knew about these techniques, but because the natives had a low population density and because they weren't fully sedentary, their lands were still considered unclaimed wilderness. So in other words, the land was considered wild and uncivilized not because it wasn't supporting human life, but because it was supporting the wrong style of human life. And that sticking point about the proper use of land can and has been used to define civilization, and that definition could become a centerpiece of your setting. Technology deficits. Writing is only really practical for a sedentary society, because writing materials tend to either be too heavy to carry long distances or too fragile to survive long journeys. And while nomadic societies do develop new techniques and new technologies over time, sedentary societies can develop technology faster, because the written word has a longer memory than the human brain. Sedentary societies can also build more infrastructure, which can then be improved on with each generation. On top of that, sedentary societies settle down at different times and develop technology at different rates. So naturally, a society with a technological advantage over its neighbors would consider their technology level to be a defining aspect of civilization, rather than a side effect. And so if you believe that civilization is superior and that technology is a value of civilization, then a high-tech society could perform reprehensible actions and still call itself superior by this definition. And in fact, that's what a lot of nations did during the 18th and 19th centuries, when European technology far outpaced the tech used by other parts of the world. Cultural and religious differences. Naturally, everyone believes that their culture is the best one, even if they also believe that cultural tolerance is important. And those who don't believe that their culture is the best typically believe that their culture is the worst, and thus still exceptional in some way. But, exceptional or not, cultures and religions do tend to change based on whether they're nomadic or sedentary, and so I'll use this section to discuss a few of the key similarities and differences. First of all, both types of culture consider the seasons, however they manifest themselves, to be important. Nomadic societies may not raise crops, but the seasons still determine food availability. For the same reason, both society types consider land to be important, even if they have different ways of using that land. And then something that is both similar and different is that Religions that feature multiple gods will tend to arrange those gods in a pattern that resembles their society. We are like this because the gods are like this, and never mind the fact that when we change our ways, we change the stories about our gods too. One of the big changes in culture between the two types of society is the level of formality. Sedentary societies have a lot more people living in much closer proximity to one another, and that tends to lead to conflicts. These conflicts need to be resolved by an impartial justice system, and this system needs to be able to handle many cases with many complexities. Something else you see is more job specialization, since advanced agriculture allows a society to produce more food using fewer people, and so more people can spend their time on other things. Distributed intelligences. A distributed intelligence is something we have no experience with in real life, but which may come up in a speculative fiction setting. The idea is that multiple organisms communicate telepathically or through radio waves or some such, and while individually they have an animal intelligence or lower, collectively they are either equal to or greater than a human in intelligence. What this means is that each member of a society would not consider itself to be an independent being. Instead, it is a part of a superorganism. And while the superorganism considers each part of itself to be important, it's only important in the same way you would consider each of your fingers to be important. The reason I bring this up is because a society would probably look very different if the society was the primary intelligence of a group. There would be no need for leadership roles, group coordination would be incredibly high, and each organism would accept its role in society without question because none of them have independent thoughts. However, a superorganism like this would also likely be highly territorial since it's functionally immortal and can control its size, and it would be unlikely to innovate quickly because it can only have one set of ideas at a time. Still, the exact appearance of a distributed intelligence civilization will depend a lot on what other characteristics it has. If it can absorb the minds and bodies of other creatures, it'll look like a zombie monster plague like the Zerg from StarCraft or the Borg from Star Trek. If an entire planet is a superorganism, then you might see a highly advanced society with 0 cities, since there would be no need for population centers to handle trade, distribution, or politics. So while cities are the hallmark of sedentary civilized societies, and while sedentary societies tend to have better technology, that doesn't mean they're the only ones who understand land management, and it doesn't mean that they are inherently superior, at least not in the eyes of their rivals. And depending on the sorts of aliens or non-humans your setting features, it's also very possible to have an advanced, complex society that doesn't feature anything like a city. So keep an open mind when you're developing a setting, and remember that every culture has its own opinion on what the best civilization means. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into weaving worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.